Hi, thank you. I just wanted to take a second and also mention that Scott Lilienfeld, who's a psychologist, and he wrote a lot about pseudoscience. He also passed away recently and sorely missed. So um, he actually helped me a lot with understanding some of the issues around facilitated communication. I'm a former facilitator, and I'm here to talk about facilitated communication, which is a technique that's been thoroughly debunked by the scientific community, but is still being used on people with severe communication difficulties associated with autism, cerebral palsy, developmental delays, and other disabilities. Technique was popularized by Rosemary Crosley of Australia and Douglas Bicklin at Syracuse University in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The promise of FC is that by simply providing emotional and physical support to the person with disabilities, as well as verbal and physical cueing, a facilitator can help the individual unlock language and literacy skills, presumably learned simply by being exposed to books or newspapers in their environment. Proponents claim the messages obtained using FC are independent, and what critics of the technique have demonstrated repeatedly in controlled settings that it's the facilitator and not the person with disabilities influencing and controlling the written output. Here's a picture. In this picture here, the facilitator is supporting the student at the wrist during the typing session. Many facilitators start this way, though support is also given at the elbow, shoulder, back leg parts of their clothing. And I'll show you some examples. And also, Adrian, I think, is going to post some links to videos in the chat for me. I appreciate that help. FC sparked imaginations of parents and educators across the United States when, in 1990, Bicklin published an article called Communication Unbound in the Harvard Review. The technique was easy to implement, required no more than a printed letterboard to work, and an ability by facilitators to provide a positive experience for their client or loved one. FC produced quick results, especially compared with existing evidence-based communication techniques and methods that sometimes required expensive equipment and costly implementation by licensed professionals. FC has no licensing or oversight requirements beyond a certificate from workshop leaders. FC put control of individuals' communication programs literally back into the hands of the parents and caregivers. Workshops were given at lending the technique credibility, and as Brian Gorman pointed out in a 1998 article, quote, turned tens of thousands of people into believers of FC overnight without presenting a shred of scientific evidence, unquote. Today, FC is viewed even by proponents as a technique of last resort, and parents continue to turn to FC when established evidence-based methods fail to provide the results that they're looking for. FC has several variants. All forms of facilitated communication rely heavily on facilitator influence to work. Here the facilitator is holding onto the individual's wrist to guide the typing, often called hand over hand. This facilitator is holding on to her son's back. You can't tell from the still image, but her fingers constantly move. These small movements control what part of the keyboard her son points to, left or right. Changes in pressure also signal him to move his fingers down to press a letter or up to wait for the next prompt. This cueing can be explained by the ideomotor phenomenon or non-conscious muscle movements more commonly associated with using a pendulum or moving a planchette on a Ouija board. The cues can be subtle, and often the facilitators are unaware of the extent to which they're controlling the messages. Here the facilitator holds the individual's sleeve as they type. Facilitators believe that fading support from the wrist to the shoulder or sleeve means they're not controlling the typing. However, without the facilitator holding on to this person's sleeve, the sophisticated written language output is virtually non-existent. While the stated goal of FC is to fade support completely so the person with disabilities can type without the facilitator present, proponents have yet to prove this actually can be done. Pro-FC research often includes facilitators in developing test protocols, negating the effect of double-blind testing, or focuses on the analysis of the written output. It's impossible to determine the separate contributions of the facilitator or the person with disabilities as they type together without these controls in place, and analyzing only the written output fails to address the issue of independent authorship. This is a form of facilitated communication known as rapid prompting method or spelling to communicate. In this variation of FC, the facilitator holds onto the letterboard holds the board in the air while the person with disabilities points to the letters up and down to meet the individual's outstretched finger. The facilitator moves the board up and down, backwards and forwards. Here, the facilitator also restrains the person with at the shoulder. Facilitators deny moving the board, claiming they can hold the board absolutely still, but they are simply too distracted by asking and answering questions to be fully aware of their own body movements. The problem with facilitated communication isn't the technology being used or the typing itself. High and low tech devices are used all the time by people with disabilities to independently express their thoughts and emotions. The problem is the amount of influence and control the facilitator has over the typed content. Remove the facilitator and the individual with disabilities is unable to express him or herself at the same fluent levels as when the facilitator is present. With legitimate forms of augmentative and alternative communication, individuals with disabilities are able to interact with and use communication devices by themselves and without interference from a facilitator. The use of FC builds an unhealthy dependence on the facilitator, and it actually inhibits independent communication. Testing is something proponents aggressively avoid by claiming that testing authorship is somehow demeaning to the individuals with disabilities or much too stressful. These same individuals using FC have presented at the United Nations for Autism Awareness Day, graduated from college, written books, produced movies, and in some cases made false allegations of abuse claims against their family. You'd think that answering a few questions that the individual with disabilities knew, but the facilitator does not know the answers to would be less stressful than any of the activities I just mentioned. Another problem with FC in all its forms is that often the person with disabilities is not looking at the letterboard during the typing sessions. Here, this is Douglas Bicklin and one of his trained facilitators interacting with the keyboard while the individual with disabilities is looking away from the board and stimming. Ironically, this is an official training video, and even their proponents were unable to follow their own guidelines. Here, Master Trainer Harvey Lavoie is fixated on the keyboard while his client Tracy Thresher has his eyes closed. The facilitator's grip indicates a lot of pressure on his client's arm and raises the question of who is actually doing the pointing. This is a slide from a group called Saved by Typing. In the video, none of the clients are looking at the keyboards, though the facilitators are actually fixated on them. None of the facilitators also correct the poor technique in their fellow facilitators, and practicing a faulty technique incorrectly for long periods of time does not make the technique any more effective. This image is from a Pro-FC film called Autism is a World, and while the individual with disabilities is capable of motor movements required to type independently, the facilitator holds the keyboard in the air as the client makes gestures towards the letters. The board visibly moves as the two work together. Strangely, the keyboard isn't always turned on, and the letters called out are dependent on the facilitator's perception of what letters were touched. Here's an example of rapid prompting method where the facilitator holds the board in the air while the individual with disabilities points to letters or at least stretches his finger in the vicinity of the board. Facilitator movement and cueing is an issue, and the translucent board here also allowed us to slow down the video and see that the person with disabilities often pointed in between letters with no distinct choice. The facilitator called out the names of letters that she thought fit with the words being spelled, regardless of what part of the letterboard was actually touched. The evidence against facilitated communication is so clear that many major health, education, and advocacy organizations have position statements opposing the use of facilitated communication and rapid prompting method. The American Speech Language Hearing Association, Association for Science and Autism Treatment, International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, most of the behavior analysis organizations worldwide, and the New York State Health Department are just some of the organizations in opposition to these techniques. However, Syracuse University, University of Northern Iowa, Cal Lutheran, University of Virginia, Growing Kids Therapy Center, HALO, and some of the designated agencies in Vermont continue to be leaders in the promotion of FC and RPM. Oberlin College, Whittier College, University of Pennsylvania, University of Vermont, and others have allowed individuals using FC and RPM to take classes and in some cases graduate from their universities despite the fact that it is impossible to tell who's actually completing the coursework when FC is in use, the facilitator or the person with disabilities. Instead of addressing the critics' concerns or stopping the practice altogether, proponents have employed some tricks to deflect attention away from the scientific evidence. In 2010, Syracuse University, for example, changed the name of the Facilitated Communication Institute to the Institute on Community Inclusion to, quote unquote, fly under the radar. Proponents have also changed the name of the practice to supported typing, hand over hand, spelling to communicate, rapid prompting method, and many others, and urge proponents to use these alternative names on individual education plans to get these discredited practices into the school systems. And in some cases like the state of Vermont actually allows Medicaid reimbursements for a discredited technique. They've also renamed themselves Facilitator, Support Assistant, Interpreter, Communication Assistant, and Communications and Regulation Partner, whatever that's supposed to mean. Increasingly, it's necessary to analyze the assistant's behavior during the typing sessions to determine whether facilitated communication is being used, regardless of what name the assistant goes by. Proponents make good use of unsuspecting reporters who want to deliver a feel-good miracle story to their audience. This was an effective tool used by proponents early in the 1990s to spread the word about FC, and now it's being used to promote supported typing, typing to communicate, spelling to communicate, rapid prompting method. December 2019, reporter Miranda Meister wrote an article titled, "After Years with No Way to Communicate, Newburgh Teen Finds Her Voice." The story featured a young woman using quote unquote motor communication, aka facilitated communication, and an Indiana news station aired the story promoting it as a quote new form of communicating. In January of 2020, a reporter, Marie Fazio, wrote an article for the Chicago Tribune titled 17-Year-Old Highland Park Boy with Nonverbal Autism Blogs to Reach Others Like Him. People need to stop underestimating us. This article touted the benefits of rapid prompting method without mentioning that proponents have failed to provide evidence that RPM produces communications independent of facilitator influence. Had either of these reporters done a simple Google search, they would have had access to the FC and RPM Wikipedia pages, which have been updated by Susan Gerbich's GSOW team of editors and includes a list of evidence-based references readily available for further investigation. The Washington Post responded slightly more responsibly when pressured in October 2020 by putting an editor's note about the dangers of FC and RPM on the article they featured called "What We Can Learn About This COVID-19 Time from a Non-Speaking Autistic Teen." However, since FC and RPM are unproven communication techniques, any advice given on behalf of a person with disabilities in this article should be taken by a grain of salt. It's highly likely that these are the thoughts of the facilitator and not the person with disabilities. Just this week, the Tampa Bay Times published an article titled "Grace is 14, autistic and quote, smarter than anyone knew," unquote, and this featured spelling to communicate. The young woman has been using the letterboard for several years and, according to Facilitated Messages, has aspirations to study internal medicine at Harvard Medical School. The ASHA quote, to their credit, they actually put one in there, but the quote was about the lack of scientific validity for FC, but it was sandwiched in between paragraphs about how great this form of communication actually is. We're also seeing a number of books and movies purportedly written by individuals with profound communication difficulties, all using facilitated communication or one of its variants. The movies Deej, Autism is a World, Wretches and Jabberers, Far from the Tree, A Mother's Courage, and The Reason I Jump are receiving international attention, but all portray an uncritical look of FC and RPM. When in October 2020, the Delco Times published an article featuring a young man with autism who purportedly written a book using a form of facilitated communication called Spelling to Communicate, we wrote a letter of concern to the reporter, editor, and publisher about the promotion of the discredited technique and provided references and organizations opposing FC and RPM. And we received the following reply: the Daily Times is not a scientific journal. We have no interest in getting involved in this controversy. The paper's stance appears to be in favor of ignoring the expertise of professionals who have dedicated their lives to develop evidence-based methods and communication devices that enable people with disabilities to communicate independently and without interference of a facilitator. Articles like these are part of the reason why FC and RPM still exist today, despite overwhelming evidence of facilitator authorship. I understand that feel-good miracle stories sell, but newspapers who promote FC and RPM are complicit in spreading misinformation when reporters fail to do their due diligence. It puts newspapers in a difficult position when faced with disconfirming evidence after stories like these are published, but nevertheless, the media needs to be held to a higher standard than the general public when it comes to actually reporting the facts. This rejection of expert advice and scientific evidence is not uncommon or limited to the media. People who already believe in FC and RPM seem to go deeper into their belief systems in the face of evidence. People who criticize the technique of FC and RPM are often criticized as being against people with disabilities, including people with disabilities who oppose FC and advocate for evidence-based measures. Proponents push back by asking critics to provide an alternative form of communication, but since proponents largely reject current proven methods and techniques, this is a moot point. Frankly, there is no substitute for a technique in which the facilitator is the primary communicator. However, I do believe that our society falls short of providing appropriate health, education, and other support to all individuals with disabilities and their families, leaving room for scientific techniques like facilitated communication to exist. We still have a long way to go in the acceptance and inclusion of individuals with disabilities and those with complex communication needs. In closing, I have given you an overview of facilitated communication. It's not an exaggeration to say that the FC community has failed to provide a reliable evidence to date to prove their claims of independent communication. Even Douglas Bicklin in a 2002 court case testified that the facilitator influence may affect anywhere from 20 to 40% of users. If so, which 60 to 80% are we to believe? I wonder too about his plan to quote unquote deal with it, because the only reliable way to identify facilitator influence is double-blind testing is aggressively rejected by proponents. We're supposed to believe FC works because people using FC say it works, and we owe it to individuals with profound communication difficulties to push back against these unfounded claims. If you're interested in more information, Susan Gerbic and I have recorded a series of YouTube interviews about facilitated communication and rapid prompting method. These can be found on her About Time YouTube channel, or check out the FC and RPM Wikipedia pages. I appreciate your time and I look forward to your questions.
All right, so let's see here. If anyone has any questions, please either do a raise hand or thumbs up, and we'll see.
There was a question about if disabled children are associated with FC, cannot their school system have special programs and training to shed light on FC? It depends on the school system. There's not a lot of school systems don't have policies in place. However, there have been a couple court cases trying to get spelling to communicate. In particular, that seems to be the flavor of the month. Trying to get that into the school systems, and they've gone to court and failed because the school systems that were in question were actually providing appropriate education for their students with disabilities. So at least that's good news. But
Craig Sachs, I think, has a question.
What would one do if, like, they notice someone's using FC, like, in their local area? Like, who do you reach out to say, hey, because, you know, I figure you don't want to approach these groups directly.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think that going to people who provide evidence-based, if I was concerned about a student, I would try to make sure that that person is actually going to somebody who uses evidence-based measures. The issue, I think, comes up when school systems or programs don't already have policies in place and somebody shows up using FC, then they make a big stink about discriminating against people with disabilities. So I think it's something that needs to be caught before it actually gets in place. Educating groups, parent groups, I think. The inoculation seems to work better than trying to change somebody's mind when they were already believing. Even schools, even like the universities support it in terms of their programs and stuff. They call it a free speech issue, even though it's totally been discredited. So I think it's a big hurdle to change even organizations' minds once it's in place.
And Benny, next.
Yeah, even though the claims have been completely, as you say, debunked, there's no proof that they work or anything, which is, I'm sure, true. But are there any benefits that can be derived from that? Because there is a certain interaction there that perhaps provides some benefits with these disabilities. Nick.
Yeah, I think that like a secondary, like unintended consequence of using facilitated communication is that the facilitators treat their clients or loved ones at maybe a different level than they would. For example, I've seen examples where a parent will be talking about their child was diagnosed as having some kind of IQ around the age of 2 or 3, but once they started using facilitated communication and all this poetry and sentences came out that were amazing, and they could have adult to peer-to-peer conversations, that all of a sudden they started talking about they started treating that person like they were their child, a loved one. Sorry, my phone just went off. I gotta shut that off. They start treating their loved one at a higher level, like they were going to college or whatever. So there's a shift in facilitators thinking about how they actually interact with their student, so or their child.
Okay. Anyone else? Did I miss?
Yeah, I had a question, Mitch. So my presentation, which is next, is about psychics, and you said, Janyce, that you see a connection between psychic mediums and the facilitators. You want to talk about that?
Sure. I think the conversation, the facilitated conversation, actually happens in the heads of the facilitators. I think what happens is they make up an idealized version of the person that they're working with, and the facilitated communication is a lot like using the Ouija board. So I think that there's a connection in terms of psychics making up information that seems to be coming from an outside agent. And that's exactly what happens with facilitated communication, that the conversations start with the facilitator, but they give the person with disabilities agency. And it's that transfer that makes me think it's similar to psychics.
All right, so so that's we are out of time for live Q&A, unfortunately.